Dr. Dunn is going to talk with us today about Egypt and Egypt's role in the period and U.S.'s relations with Egypt. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, Egypt to the Egyptians is Dunya, the mother of all nations. So it's a very important player in whatever comes. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. You know, as Heidi indicated, I've been doing this for quite a while. I first started studying the Middle East about 40 years ago. I've done a little bit of everything at one time or another, teaching at the university level, writing, editing, reporting, lecturing, et cetera, et cetera. And every now and then somebody asks me what I think is going to happen next, and I have to give the honest answer. I haven't a clue. The last 6 months, everything I thought I knew about the Middle East has been turned on its head. And any Middle East expert who claimed they saw this coming and saw all of it coming is really, I think, pulling your leg. We didn't see it coming. We knew, obviously, that there were enormous demographic and economic and other pressures in the region. We knew that we had a region on our hands where half the population of most countries are younger than 25, and in most cases, the leadership has been in power longer than that, so that most of the population in the Middle East have never known a leader other than Hosni Mubarak, Muammar Gaddafi, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or someone named Assad in Syria. As a result, I think we've tended to know that there was a powder keg, but we've gotten so used to the fact that it never blows up that we're all caught off guard when it does. As Heidi mentioned, the Egyptians say, Masr Dunya, Egypt is the mother of the world. And as such, it is a very central place in the Arab world. With 80 million people, it's the largest country by far in the Arab world. It's the land bridge between Africa and Asia. It's an important connector between the Eastern Arab world and the Maghreb, the Western Arab world in North Africa. The Suez Canal, of course, is a critical choke point for the world's oil supply coming from the Red Sea into the Mediterranean and connecting Europe with Asia. The Nile, since the earliest stages of civilization, has been the Mediterranean route into inner Africa. And of course, as the first Arab country to make peace with Israel after Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977 and Camp David in 1979, Egypt has been a cornerstone of American strategic policy in the Middle East as a reliable ally of ourselves and a friendly state to Israel. Instability in Egypt has always been a great bugaboo for American policy, and as a result, I think perhaps we bet on the old regime a lot longer than Egyptians were willing to put up with. Egypt was, of course, the second Arab country to throw out its leader after Tunisia. Tunisia is a lovely country, but it's remote from the Central Arab world. It's a lot different from most other Arab countries. It's a small country. A lot of Arabs have never been there. Tunisia is something of an outlier. What happens in Tunisia can stay in Tunisia most of the time. It didn't in this case, but most of the time it can. What happens in Egypt shakes the whole Arab world. So in many ways, I think the revolutionary events in Egypt are much more critical to forming the future of the region than the similar events in Tunisia, though that's not in any way to underestimate the importance of the Tunisian upheaval, which inspired the Egyptian one and showed the Egyptian people that it could be done. There are a lot of factors, I think, that made Egypt, once this Arab Spring got rolling, that made Egypt an obvious venue for what was going on. One of them, of course, is that Hosni Mubarak has been in power for 30 years, and he turned 83 in April. By the time he turned 83, he actually wasn't president anymore, but it was well known to everybody that he was up for re-election this year. That re-election had always been, of course, something he could take for granted because the elections were not truly competitive. It was generally assumed that he would either run for a sixth term of office, one that would take him almost to the age of 90, or that he would hand off power to his son Gamal. In either case, it was going to be more of the same. Either a very, very elderly man who had been in power since 1981, or his son in an inheritance in which, like a royal title, it was passed on from father to son, as had also happened in Syria. So Egypt was an obvious potential case. And needless to say, after the success of the Tunisian Revolution, the Egyptian opposition, a broad range of Egyptian opposition, was mobilized to turn against the regime. Now, it's very easy to overemphasize the role of social media, of Facebook and Twitter in organizing this revolution, because the face that most Westerners saw of the Egyptian revolution was very clearly one of young people, men and women both, technically savvy university graduates, people with a lot of education, a lot of skill. But if you actually looked at some of the gatherings in Tahrir Square, you also saw a very wide range of people. People who appeared to be poor folks from the underside of Cairo, peasants, farmers, workers. Actually, it has received almost no publicity here, but the labor movement, the workers in the factories in Mahala and other big industrial cities in the Delta, really got this started last year. There had been a wave of general strikes, but the labor movement side, because it wasn't in Cairo, because the international cameras weren't there, and because they weren't on Twitter and Facebook, never got anything like the publicity that was given to the young people in Tahrir. But in fact, the labor movement has been very, very active. The workers in the big industrial factories have been on strike for on and off for a year and a half now. And so this began rolling out in the countryside to some extent where people weren't seeing it, but it eventually reached Cairo. The situation is similar to that in other Arab countries. The overwhelming majority of the population is young. They aren't all college-educated Facebook users and Twitter users. A lot of them are illiterate farmers, and we don't know what their political orientations are. A lot of them are urban poor. A lot of them work in industry. And a lot of them are in the armed forces and the police, which traditionally have not had a vote, and it's still being debated as to whether they're going to have a vote now. The emblem of Arab Spring generally, of course, was the young man Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, who, college educated, was unable to get any job, and so he took to selling fruits and vegetables from a vendor's cart. And when the police harassed him and knocked him around because he didn't have the right license to be selling his vegetables, he killed himself. And he became a symbol that ignited the Tunisian Revolution. There are a lot of Mohammed Bouazizis in Egypt. There was one named Khalid Said who died a year ago in Alexandria after being beaten up by security police. A young man, computer user, just a typical frustrated youth who really didn't do anything wrong except express some discontent. But as the government got more and more elderly, as Mubarak aged, as discontent spread, as labor unrest spread, typically for a third world autocratic regime, the national security state, the instruments of state security and Egypt's overlapping security and intelligence apparatus began to crack down harder and harder. But for the first time, this national security apparatus that goes all the way back to the Nasser years of the 1950s, for the first time, it was not enough. People finally said no. And when they were ready to die in the streets, ultimately, the army stepped in and said, no, this has gone far enough, and pushed Mubarak out of office. The question is, what do we have in Egypt right now? And I think what we have is an unfinished revolution, a revolution in progress. It may ultimately be defeated. We could see the old establishment, the old guard, and particularly the army, reestablish something like the old regime. It could turn out to be genuinely revolutionary, and we could get some sort of radical leadership, whether the Muslim Brotherhood, some other Islamist force, or even a left-wing force. None of these things are completely impossible. Because for decades, the government suppressed most other political movements other than a few tolerated government-friendly parties, and because the Muslim Brotherhood was the largest, though illegal, the largest organized body other than the ruling party, most Western analysts focused on the Muslim Brotherhood to the extent they may not be noting all the other varying factors at play in Egypt. One of the first things we saw as soon as parties could organize freely is that younger members of the Muslim Brotherhood started splitting off and forming new, more progressive Islamist parties of their own. Other new Islamist parties began to emerge. The Sufi orders came out and started organizing political movements of their own. So there isn't just one religious tendency in Egypt anymore. There are many, many of them. Just as there are many, many liberal parties, there are many, many other parties. There are parties ranging from right to left, and there are parties growing every day. Whether there will be a set of electoral alliances that emerge, which is what I suspect will happen, or something else will emerge, I don't know. Because like I say, I don't really know what's going to happen next. I do know that revolutions keep happening in the Arab world. We've seen, obviously an ongoing collapse in Yemen, a civil war in Libya, extreme bloodshed in Syria. I believe each country is different, and therefore Egypt is not an absolute role model for everybody else, and clearly the other countries have not followed Egypt's particular course in ousting the former leader relatively peacefully with a few hundred people dead, rather than the thousands and perhaps tens of thousands that we have seen in Libya and in Syria, or the ongoing bloodshed in Yemen. But Egypt is the center of the Arab world. And if Egypt can successfully build something like a real democratic polity, whatever its orientation, left, right, secular, Islamist, whatever its organization, if it can create a political unit that people see as actually representing the will of the people, then I think it will be an extremely important model for the rest of the Arab world. But that's a big if. We aren't there yet. This revolution isn't over. I'm not even sure if it's a revolution. For decades now, really since the end of the colonial period, the word revolution in the Arab world, thawra, has usually been simply what they called the last military coup. And most of these have been military coups replacing other military juntas, and they haven't been very revolutionary. They haven't changed the political life, they haven't changed the society. Nasser's coup in 1952 did, to some extent, lead to real land reform and social reforms, but it also led to several wars with Israel and, of course, to the creation of that national security state that I mentioned already. There are a lot of possibilities ahead. I'm not even sure the Egyptian revolution has really begun. They're still arguing over whether to draw up the new constitution before elections that are currently scheduled for September, or whether to go ahead and hold the elections first, as currently planned, in September, and then establish the process for drawing up new elections. The newer parties want longer because they want more time to organize. The Muslim Brotherhood, which is already well organized, wants to move ahead as quickly as possible for elections for obvious electoral calculations of its own. But basically, the most important and one of the single largest and most powerful elements of the old regime, the army, is very much still in place and is very much in the form of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the effective government, although it's not a very visible government. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces lives by communiques signed by the council collectively, not by Field Marshal Tantawi. The chairman of the council, Field Marshal Tantawi, has made one public speech since the fall of Mubarak. The army has been faceless. This is not a traditional military coup sort of thing, but it's behind the scenes, and it's very much behind the scenes. And one of the questions is whether, though the army continues to insist that it wants elections and it wants to hand off to a civilian government, is what role exactly does the army see for itself in a civilian-governed Egypt? And no one really knows, because the members of the council who actually appear on television are mostly second-string major generals, deputy defense ministers, things like that. Some of them are very bright, but they're not necessarily who's calling the shots, or maybe they are. The fact is, we don't really know who's calling the shots. And I think that, therefore, there is a real possibility, that the army sees itself as being the man behind the curtain, the mover and shaper of a civilian elected government, but always in the wings. The so-called Turkish model, where the Turkish army saw itself as the guarantor of secularism, where the Turkish army was always waiting in the wings to step in and oust an elected government if it felt it overstepped the bounds of Kemalism, of the Turkish secularism and the secular state. That may be the model that the Egyptian army envisions for itself. But we don't know yet. There is so much we don't know yet. I couldn't tell you right now, in June, if elections will be held in September or not. I think the army wants them then. Some political parties want them then. Other political parties want to postpone them and amend the Constitution first. But if the Constitution is amended more than the amendments that have already been passed by referendum, the Constitution could be changed to dramatically change the electoral system. Egypt once had a proportional representation system. Now it has a constituency system, but that could change back to proportional representation, and that would change all the political calculuses of all the political parties currently in existence. So we don't know. It's very early days yet. And I called these remarks reflections on the unfinished revolution in Egypt because I think the fact is it really is unfinished. Now you can argue that all real revolutions are unfinished. But as I said, in the Middle East, with the exception of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which really did overthrow a society and install a very different sort of a government. Most revolutions in the Arab world, at least, have been military coups and nothing more. But real revolutions can take a long time to emerge. Think about the French Revolution, or even the American one, the time between the outbreak of conflict in 1776. The American Constitution wasn't adopted until 1789, after nearly a decade of the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work very well and needed to be replaced. Or, to quote another famous quote, it is said that the late Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister for many years and an ideologue of the Chinese Revolution, was once asked by someone what his opinion was of the French Revolution. And Zhou supposedly responded, "It's too soon to tell." And I think that if it's too soon to be sure about the French Revolution more than 200 years later, it is certainly too soon to say what's going on in Egypt only a few months after the ouster of Hosni Mubarak. But something has definitely changed. The victory's not won, the long-term winners are far from clear, but the political space has been opened up in a whole new way. The referendum on constitutional amendments that was held, I think it was in March or April, a few months ago after the fall of Mubarak, was generally held by most Egyptians, whether they voted for it or against it, to be the first really free vote they had had in decades since the military coup of 1952. And since most of them weren't alive back before then, the first real election, with the votes probably actually being counted, that Egypt has held in the lives of the vast majority of Egyptians. Political space has been opened up in new ways. The media has been freed, although the army still keeps a fairly close watch on any criticism of the army. The media is doing investigations into corruption, into the financial plundering of the old regime. The media is getting pretty wild and woolly at times, even the state media. Even Al Ahram, the old government-owned newspaper, on the day Mubarak fell, Al Ahram, which had been supporting the government up to that time, suddenly had a headline saying, "The people have ousted the regime." And when the mouthpiece of the old regime puts a headline like that up, you know something's changed, and a lot has. It's easy enough to say, look, the army's still in power, the army is still the same old guys who were Mubarak's cronies. It's all true. The former interior minister and the upper echelons of generals in state security were replaced, and the state security apparatus was replaced with a new agency called the National Security Sector. Now, this is obviously much nicer. It's from the nation, not from the state. And while it's still security, it's a mere sector, not an apparatus. But gosh, who do you think the generals are? They're all the people who were second echelon generals in the old state security. So there's still a lot of the old regime in place. The most corrupt, the most outrageous, the most hated ones are mostly in jail and being investigated for corruption. But the rest, they're still in place. And so while the revolution has changed a lot, it hasn't changed everything. But it could if real elections are held, and so far they show every sign of happening. Then regardless of which electoral system or which constitution is in place, if real elections were held and real results are honored, we're going to see a very different Egypt than the one we have seen, really, for the past 60 years. Even though Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak were very different men, even though Nasser took Egypt into the Soviet Union's camp and Sadat took it into the American camp instead, it was all really the same regime since 1952, or at least since 1954. And that has changed. It may end up looking a lot like the old regime, but so far I think there's a lot of cause for hope that it will not. At the same time, though, there is danger of having a long period of dramatically changing leadership, something like what happened in Iran in the first year of the revolution, until finally the clerical establishment just stepped in and ran things for themselves. You may remember, those of you who are old enough to remember the Iranian Revolution, the sequence of Presidents Beni Sadr and Khurramzadeh and so on, until finally the clerical regime in all its glory consolidated its power. We could see something like that, and it could end up with an Islamist government, or it could end up with a secularist government, or more likely it could end up with some kind of delicate balance between the two. Perhaps you would have not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but a range of religious parties that function something like the religious bloc in Israel. They don't all agree with each other, but they tend to vote together on critical issues against the secularist parties. Something like that could emerge in Egypt. We don't know. It's too soon to tell. The young people who led the revolution, and I want to continue to emphasize, I don't just mean the young Facebook people. I mean the workers in the great cloth factories in Mahala and the peasants in the streets, the people who, when the police were pulled off the streets, all over the place started organizing people's committees to protect their neighborhoods. Within about 48 to 72 hours, by various estimates I've seen, every neighborhood in Alexandria had its own people's committee after the police disappeared. Because the old regime thought, what we're going to do is we're going to pull the police off the streets, there'll be anarchy, everybody will beg the government to come back and crack down. Instead, people took their own security into their own hands. They formed these neighborhood committees. They set up checkpoints. They protected the city for the most part. Of course, there was looting. There was a theft of antiquities. There were some very unfortunate things happen, but with exceptions, they protected their neighborhoods without the benefit of the police. It's a deadly thing to a national security regime to have the people find out you don't need the police. You don't need the security services. They can do it themselves. And that's what happened in both Cairo and Alexandria. To this day, we don't know what happened in a lot of other cities. I think there will be doctoral dissertations written for the next 50 years on what happened in Suez and Ismailia and Aswan and Luxor and Sohag and all the provincial capitals. But because most of the cameras, most of the foreign reporters were in Cairo or in Alexandria. I think we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know who the winners are going to be. But the mere opening up of political space makes it hard to close it again. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it hard. For the first time, perhaps, in Egypt's history, the future may, and always emphasizing may because a lot can happen, may lie in the hands of the Egyptian people, not in the hands of some pharaoh or colonial power or king or junta. But it may. We're not quite there yet. The next year will be crucial. That will not finish the story. I don't think we'll know a year from now what Egypt will look like 10 years from now. But I think we'll know a lot more a year from now than we know right now. And we'll at least have some idea of the direction. Is this going to really evolve into some kind of democratic system? Or is it going to revert into something like the old regime? Or is it going to turn into anarchic situation? Are you going to get a vengeful revolutionary regime that does the equivalent of setting up the guillotines? Is there going to be a Jacobin period to this, or is there going to be a Thermidorian reaction a la the French Revolution? Or is there going to be both? I don't know. I do know we have nothing to compare this to. A lot of people during the Egyptian Revolution were comparing it to various things that have happened in the past, the 1977 bread riots, for example, or the police riot of the 80s. It's nothing like those things. The only thing in modern Egyptian history to compare it to was the 1919 uprising against the British, what Egyptians call the 1919 revolution. Some people even brought out the old flag of the 1919 revolution, which is a crescent and a cross, to indicate that Muslims and Christians both were fighting together. The 1919 revolution had no clear leadership. It came from the bottom up. It came from anger when the leadership of the national movement was deported by the British. It came across society, from the fellahin in the countryside to the urban workers to the middle classes. Yet most people haven't even heard of the 1919 revolution in the West, unless they've read the first volume of Naguib Mahfouz's trilogy, maybe. I think it's the first volume. And most people didn't think of it when journalists were groping for something to compare it to. But it really is probably the only thing comparable in modern Egyptian history that I know of. It wasn't a military coup like the so-called revolution of 1952 or the Arabi revolt of 1881. Those were military coups in more or less classic sense. They may have had popular support, but they depended on the army. The army didn't lead this one. In the end, the army helped finish it by pushing Mubarak out, but the army was not in the vanguard of this one. The people were. And again, not just the Facebook people. There were Egyptian workers. There were Egyptian peasants in these demonstrations. Now, I'm sure that the future they envision is not the same one the future the young Twitter users envision. That's the thing we've got to keep in mind. We really don't know what the vast majority of Egyptians are thinking. But I think we're going to find out. How will this impact the rest of the Arab world? Well, of course, since we don't know what's going to happen next in Egypt, we don't know what effect it will have on its neighbors. I think that the preoccupation of the Egyptian army with governing the country from behind the curtain, as it were, has meant that Egypt has paid less attention to the events in Libya than would otherwise be the case. The normal case, if there was a civil war going on in Libya next door, is that the Egyptian army and the Egyptian government would be very, very much involved. Now, they may be. I suspect there are Egyptian special forces operating with the Libyan rebels, for example, but I can't prove it. But certainly the level of influence and potential intervention that you would normally see hasn't been the case because the Egyptian army is stuck running the country. As a model, though, if Egypt really does succeed in creating some kind of functional democracy, and I do not mean it's going to look just like a Westminster democracy or an American democracy or a French democracy even, but if they create some kind of credible government that is responsive to and reflects the will of the people, that will have an impact on other countries, particularly the more thoughtful and well-educated other Arab countries, potentially including Syria, for example, and the Gulf states. What happens in Libya, Yemen, and Syria is also important, of course, and as are such questions as whether the reforms announced by the kings in both Morocco and Jordan will be acceptable to the people and will actually satisfy people's demands, or whether demonstrations will continue in those countries. But Egypt is still the center of the Middle East, and I know a lot of other Arabs resent that and will argue with it. But I think it's indisputably the case that this very large Arab country, 80 million people, that dominates the film industry in the Arab world, that is, alongside Lebanon, dominates much of the publishing industry in the Arab world, is going to have an enormous influence on the rest of the region.